and yet we don't want to fall into the same pitfalls that our fathers fell into. So some of us would say that we're kind of like Isaac. And some of us are like, maybe like Jacob. This would be kind of the blessed generation if there's anybody in here that would say they're Jacob. He has several generations prior to him of faithful men doing their best to build the groundwork. Now, Jacob is no angel. Jacob he's a deceiver. He has struggles of his own, but when he finally, after he wrestles with God and finally submits to God, God blesses him and uses him in a special way that would then become, the nation of Israel. So I think all of us fall into one of those three categories, with maybe an exception here or there. So, are you Abraham? Are you the first generation Christian coming out of a pagan background? Maybe you recognize that you've made some mistakes. So, if you look at the Genesis 3 Adam and Eve sin, and then the Genesis 16 Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah situation, there's parallels drawn there for a reason. We're supposed to look, and even though we have Abraham as this great man of faith, he's in the Hebrews Hall of Fame of faith, we still see the parallels being drawn. So listen to this. So this is Genesis 3. God says to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife. Genesis 16, Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. Genesis 3, so she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Genesis 16, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant woman, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. So he went into her, and she conceived. So we see this parallel, even with the original sin that happened. Abraham and Sarai are still kind of dealing with the same issues. He wasn't perfect, and yet he was the patriarch. Hebrews 7:4 doesn't say he's one of the patriarchs. He says he is the patriarch. So if you are the Abraham generation, you are called to a high calling, but it's also going to require a high cost. You have been given a unique opportunity that the following generations will not be given, but hopefully you will give them a leg up. You will give them, the groundwork already having been laid, so their struggle is not the same one that you had. So are you Isaac? Did you grow up in church, but again, you're wanting to break away from some of the pitfalls your father fell into? Or are you Jacob? Do you have several generations of faithful men behind you? Are you just needing to grow in your personal faith and disciplines? Could it be that the men of this church is what God is going to use to bless Shepherdsville, or could it be that our sons are the generation that God is going to use to bless Shepherdsville? We can't sit around and pray for God's blessing and God's revival to come to Shepherdsville if we're not willing to do the work on our end, if we're not willing to lay this foundation, if we're not willing to raise our sons to be men that can handle this task. Dr. O, you might have heard him say this. It's a quote, I believe, from Alexander White. He says, "The stone that is fit for the wall will not be left to lie in the way." So if we want the Lord to use us to build a wall for his glory that will remain for hundreds of years, we need to make sure that we're fashioning ourselves into stones that are fit for the task. And we will be used. We will not be left to lie in the way. So now if we break down practically, what do we need to do then to step into this role? I think we can break it down to 3 Ds. So disciplines, direction, and discipleship. Those 3 Ds. Now, by disciplines, I mean spiritual disciplines. So like Jim Bob's book, The Spiritual Disciplines of Christian Life. This is kind of the inward focus. We can't lead our family if we're not willing to go there as well. We need to be the first ones leading from the front. Dr. O covered this in a Wednesday a couple weeks ago. The question was, Baptist Catechism, what are the outward means whereby Christ communicateth to us the benefits of redemption? The answer, the outward and ordinary means whereby Christ communicateth to us the benefits of redemption are his ordinances, especially the word, baptism, the Lord's Supper, and prayer, all of which means are made effectual to the elect for salvation. So we need to make sure that we're diligent Bible readers. We need to study the Bible both in its breadth and in depth. You don't want to only know one book of the Bible really well. You want to be familiar with the whole book and then take time to dig into one passage at a time. Hopefully walking your family through that as you do it. We need to be men of prayer, going boldly into the throne room to intercede on behalf of our family. If we want to emulate Christ as prophet, priest, and king, We need to make sure we're doing the prophet and the priestly work before we expect to be looked at as the king of our family. We need to be a prophet telling them what the Word of God says and how it applies to their life. And we need to be a priest by going in and interceding on their behalf. Now, one of the most important things, and if you're here today, this is probably not an issue, is setting aside the Lord's Day for worship. That covers a multitude of areas. We have the Lord's Supper. Are we doing that this weekend? I know we missed the first. So we are. So we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper tomorrow. So, make that a big deal for your family. Remind them to look inwardly at their hearts. Prepare themselves as they come before the Lord for the Lord's Supper. Baptism, not even our own baptism, but also when a new member or a new Christian gets baptized, we remember our baptism, what it means, what it represents. If you're here on the Lord's Day, you'll sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And this is great because more people are going to walk around throughout the day singing a hymn in their head than they will quote a Bible verse in their head. It sometimes amazes me how many songs Raylan has memorized. She listens to Keith and Kristen Getty almost constantly. And she knows, even though she can't read, when we do the YouTube videos with the lyrics, I'm singing because I can read and I know it. She's singing it because she's memorized it. So we can have children who aren't even old enough to read that already have good doctrine in their heads as they walk throughout the day. We're going to sit under expository preaching, good expository preaching. Dr. O has spent a long time, kind of cultivating this craft of his. David Presley says that it's world-class preaching, here at Bullitt Lick. And I would argue that most churches 10 times our size could not go as deep on the depth chart as Bullitt Lick does. You've got, tomorrow Dr. O's going to be out of town. Isaac's going to preach. I would be willing to bet that the best sermon preached in Bullitt County tomorrow will still be at Bullitt Lick, even though Dr. Work's not here. If Isaac's not here, Jimmy's going to preach. Jimmy travels the country preaching at churches, and yet he's the backup at Bullitt Lick. We are blessed with good preaching. We're going to cultivate friendships that will challenge us. So that's one of the biggest blessings that's been here. Even though I had good friends at our old church, they were good friendships, but they didn't challenge me. I wasn't surrounded by like-minded men who were, endeavoring to be faithful. They were I want to say complacent. That's not correct. But if you compare the two, I won't say they weren't endeavoring after faithfulness, but if you compare the two, it would look like the other one's sitting still. But we have good men here, good men who can encourage and challenge you. And then probably the most important one, most overlooked one, is finding a mentor. So I'd reached out to a couple of pastors that I thought were good, faithful men who had really dug into what it looks like to lead your family. And one of the guys' name is John Moody. And I reached out to him, talked to him on the phone, and he said if he could recommend, and this is a guy that came out of a completely unchurched family. Dad was an alcoholic, whole 9 yards. And he said the number one thing he could do for a young man was to find him a mentor that he could trust and then verify that what he was telling him was good information. This is where we need to find our mentors. We don't need to go to YouTube. We don't need to go to the internet to find a mentor who has no idea you exist, who you can't see their family and the fruit of their labors. They need to know you. They need to be able to keep you accountable, and you need to be able to see their fruit so you know what they're actually saying is true. There's too many, quote-unquote experts on the internet they'll be able to give you a perfect sermon, and then you hear the scandals come out later, and it taints everything that they've ever said. It's like, well, were they really even saved? Or did they just like to get up and preach? Were they really endeavoring to be faithful? Or do they just like to stand here under these really bright lights? Men need to be willing to wake up a little earlier, stay up a little later, forego the video games, the movies, the golf, if that's what it takes to use these means effectively. So I'm not against recreation outright, but if you're spending so much time working on your backswing that your family is being left unattended, you need to cut it back. If you think about pruning, we're kind of in the pruning season. I'm not a farmer or a gardener, but I think people prune right now. Maybe this winter is when we look at pruning our schedules. Because sometimes you cut the tree back, and it almost works against reason. You cut the tree down, but next year it grows more fruit. Maybe we need to prune our schedules this winter. It's sometimes said, you are who you surround yourself with. Are you surrounding yourself with godly men? Are you surrounding yourself with good books? Are you reading, studying the Bible, meditating on its meaning, contemplating on its impact for your life? Are we using our time wisely? Another thing Dr. O has said, if you listen to the Be Men message from the Family Reformation Conference, you heard him say this quote, "What you do crowds out what you might have done for good or for ill." Spending time watching movies might not be inherently sinful, but could it have been used better? Because now that movie has crowded out 2 hours of your life that could have been used for something very productive, or vice versa. You've got an hour home alone, and no one's going to know what you're doing, but you spend that time studying the Bible and poring over Scripture, and now that crowds out something that would have been inherently sinful. So what you do crowds out the thing you might have done for good or for ill. So we need to make sure we're taking our disciplines seriously. Now, the second D was direction. Disciplines, direction, discipleship. So do we have a direction in life? Are you complacent with your spiritual state? Because here's the thing. Women are designed to be led. That is in their nature. They are made to be helpmeets. They are not made to be leaders. They're designed to be led. But that's a good and a bad thing. Because if you are a husband and you are the first person that's converted in your family and you begin coming to church, statistics say that 93% of the time your family will follow. Whereas if the wife, it's like 33% or 36%. But that also means that if you are leading them away from the church, if you're leading them away from God, they're going to follow you there too. So women are designed to be led, but we have to lead. We are designed to be leaders. We are leaders. Lead them in a good direction. That also means that if you are stagnant, there's a very good chance your wife will be stagnant. That was the issue with Morgan and I. For a long time, I was not a good leader. I was a poor leader. My wife's spiritual state was stagnant. It wasn't until I started getting myself right, it wasn't until I got saved, I started reading the Bible, I started taking my role seriously, that Morgan began to flourish. We need to take this seriously. That's why I'm so passionate about this topic, is because for so many years, I wasted my influence on my wife's spiritual state because I wasn't taking it seriously. We need to convey the desire to better our family with passion. I took a class at Fort Knox a couple years ago, and everybody knows what a Humvee is. So the truck that's replacing the Humvee is called a MATV. And I was getting certified to be an instructor on these MATVs, and I had to sit through a class. It was a PowerPoint, day-long PowerPoint, all about the turning radius, the fuel capacity, the gross weight of these trucks, and it was the most boring material I've ever covered in my entire life. And we've sat through law classes, which are extremely boring. This was much worse. We had a really boring teacher, and half the class was falling asleep until there was a master sergeant that was there, and this dude really liked trucks. Like, he went to trucking expos on his own dime, on his own time, because he just loved trucks. And even though I did not care about the material, when his portion of the class that he taught, I enjoyed, because he was passionate about it. You could feel it. So, can you make yourself so passionate about this that your family feels it? Even if it's at the first, even if they haven't bought in yet. Even if they say, I don't know where we're going, but he's really worked up about something, so I'm going to follow after him. And then hopefully, over time, as they see the fruit of your labor, they actually buy into it themselves. And then your whole family is zealous for wherever you're taking them. And that can kind of get more narrow as it goes. We don't have to know the 8-digit grid, coordinates right this second. But we need to know we're going that way. We're not going this way. We're going that way. I want you to follow after me. And they will. Most of the time, they will. Joel Beakey tells a story that when his father was passing away, individually, I think they have 5 kids. His dad had 5 kids. Individually, they all went and sat with their father and told them their most cherished memory. And they hadn't talked about it beforehand. There was no collusion going on. But they went in and they told him about it, and each of them had the exact same answer. And they said it was on Sundays when they would do family worship and they would go through the Pilgrim's Progress. And they said with tears in his eyes, he would beg God to save his children. And that each of those kids, that's what they remembered. Because they could see the passion in their dad's eyes. They could feel his emotion. This wasn't a box he was checking off. This was something he cared about. He cared about his kids. He wanted them to be saved. If you can get passionate about it, your family will be passionate about it. over the last century and a half, dispensationalism has is pervasive throughout the church. Dr. O would be probably the very small minority of people in Southern Baptist churches or evangelical churches in America that wouldn't hold to dispensationalism. The problem, there's good men that believe it. One of the biggest issues with dispensationalism is not even the exegesis, it's what fruit it's born. It's a very pessimistic eschatology. It's we lose down here, we need to build a bunker mentality. And I remember I said this in our Sunday school class. I remember growing up and being so sure that Jesus would come back while I was still young. I never thought I was getting married. I used to hear an air horn, and I would kind of pause, like, are we going? Is this it? And then after I was still on the ground for a little bit, I figured it was a false alarm. But it's a pessimistic eschatology. And I'm not saying that you should not believe it because it's pessimistic. Because there are other positions within that realm of study. They're also pessimistic. But people get so sure that Jesus is coming back in their lifetime, they never look ahead at their grandkids. That's what I'm trying to change. Even if you believe in a pessimistic eschatology, think about your grandkids. What are you doing now that is going to benefit your kids? Proverbs say that a wise man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. Not just your children that are right in front of you. I'm not trying to only think about Raylan and Judson. I'm trying to think about kids whose names I don't know. Praying to God that He will bless me in this time of my life, that I might be able to do things now that will benefit them. If anyone here listens to the Haunted Cosmos, you might know the name Ben Garrett. Ben Garrett and Brian Sauvé are the two guys that run that podcast. So I reached out to Ben Garrett, asked him this question: What does someone have to do? What does a man have to do if he wants to be the patriarch of his family? I really liked his answer because it's got such a broad application. He said, a true patriarch must enjoy giving his strength for the highest good of his family. So how do we do that? Maybe we learn a skill instead of binge watching The Office for the 5th time. And I love The Office. I've seen The Office all the way through 4 times. I don't need to see it a 5th time. I've got enough of the quotes memorized. Jimmy and I's conversations are sometimes just Office memes back and forth. I don't need to watch it a 5th time. What I do need to do is build more skills so that Judson, when he grows up, when he turns 18, he's got a whole skill set that I didn't have at 18. We need to be willing to forego certain things so that we can use that time or those resources to impact future generations. Don't spend the most virile years of your life building an empire in virtual reality while the blessings God has given you in this reality are left unattended. So direction. You have to lead them somewhere. You have to know where you're going. You can't lead them to nowhere, and we surely don't want to lead them down a path of destruction. Now lastly, discipleship. So again, disciplines, direction, discipleship. Discipleship, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the here and the now. Disciplines is something that's going to take a long time. That's a lifetime of disciplines to grow in piety and holiness. Direction is kind of big picture, future plans. Discipleship starts here and now. This will hopefully be more practical. But if you can take away one thing from this message, it is this next statement. Husbands, fathers, it is 100% your duty to disciple your wife and children. The church is here to supplement, not replace your efforts. It is our responsibility. It's not Dr. O's responsibility to come in and personally disciple my wife. It is my responsibility. I am her spiritual head. He has been given spiritual oversight over his flock, of which she is a part, but I am her spiritual head. So we have to be willing to set aside time daily to lead our family in what we call family worship. Maybe you call it family devotionals. Maybe you just start by leading your family in prayer at night and hopefully build on that over time. But we need to make it a priority, and we need to do it daily because the Lord is worthy of worship every day, not just on Sundays. Now, a year and a half ago probably, we did a family worship men's breakfast. I'll try it if we can find it. I'll try to post it somewhere if anybody wants to go back and watch it. And then also, not tomorrow because Isaac's preaching, but the following week, Dr. O is planning on preaching on family worship. So hopefully everybody will be able to catch that, or if not, catch it on a podcast later. But we've got, again, our children and our wife. These are, as the patriarchs currently, These are the people we've been in charge of. So children, we need to speak about spiritual things with them. Dr. O, this was his thing during that family worship men's breakfast. He said the temperature in your house should not change whenever you begin to speak about spiritual things. It should be normal. When you speak about God or serving God or growing in holiness, it shouldn't make everybody pause and look at you. It should just be a normal everyday conversation because you're talking about these things. When you wake up, when you lie down, when you walk by the way, all the time. We need to pray with them, pray for them. Again, interceding on their behalf, teaching them how to pray. We need to be aware of who your children are spending your time with. As cops, we see this a lot. Sometimes you'll have a family where a seemingly good kid goes down a wrong path, and it's almost always because of the kids that they met at school or the kids in the neighborhood that didn't come from good families. Who your kids hang around with matters. And this one might be a little antiquated, but we need to have more oversight in trying to find our children wives and husbands. If you think about Abraham, Abraham's biggest sin was with Hagar. But did he let Isaac fall into the same trap? No. He went out. He sent his servant to go into a foreign country, back to his homeland, because he didn't want his daughter, he didn't want his son marrying a Canaanite daughter. He went and found him a good wife. Now it's just kind of something that you do out of, tradition, I guess, to ask the father for the woman's hand in marriage. But that used to mean something. The husband, the father, used to actually be able to say, no, you're not good enough to marry my daughter. So today, legally, you can't actually do that. But if you have a good enough relationship with your daughter, hopefully she will respect, what you have to say. And sweetheart, I don't think this is the type of leadership you want in your life. He's not a good enough man for you. We need to have these type of relationships so we can get some of that back. And then wives. How do we disciple our wives? We have been given the responsibility to lead our wives as their spiritual head. And this cannot be abdicated. We cannot pawn it off on the church. Again, the church is here to supplement, not to replace. If you were here for our little Thanksgiving Wednesday night service where we got up and said what God had done for us this year, one of the things I was thankful for was Sarah Smith. She has been a huge benefit to Morgan. She has come alongside her and has taught her things that I could never teach her. I don't know what it's like to be a wife. I don't know what it's like to be a mother. Sarah has taken that Titus 2 outline and then implemented it into her life. So she's pouring into the younger women. But what it's not her job to do is to be Morgan's spiritual head. The way I see it, on Judgment Day, 4 people or 4 types of people will stand before God and give an account for what Morgan has done in her life. First, Morgan. Morgan's sins are her own. She will be held responsible for them. But then there will be 3 types of men that will stand before God and give an account for the way that they led her. From infancy until she was 20, that would be her father. Her father will give an account for the way that he raised Morgan and the spiritual guidance that he gave her. From 20 until I die or until Morgan passes away, it will be me. And then lastly, it will be her elders. So now, Jim Bob, Dean, Dr. O. Previously, no one knows. I don't know who the elders at Southeast are. I'm convinced no one does. But, okay, I got a couple smiles. It's all right, tough crowd, I get it. No. But the elders will be given spiritual oversight over their flocks, again, of which she is a part. And we will all stand before God one day, and we will give an account for the way that we guided and led Morgan. But again, I am her spiritual head currently. The majority of that falls on my shoulders. They have, hundreds of people that they are responsible for. I'm responsible for 1 woman and 2 kids. That majority of that will fall on me. So, how do we do this? How do we turn the tide? We have to be willing to tell our wives no and to lovingly challenge them. So, keyword lovingly, keyword challenge. Because men tend to do one or the other. We rarely do both. We tend to lovingly give them everything they want because it's easier, or we tend to be harsh and unlovingly challenge them. We need to do both. Lovingly challenge. Adam should have told Eve no. Abraham should have lovingly told Sarah that that's a dumb idea. I'm not sleeping with your slave woman. That would have saved the whole world a whole lot of trouble. And not only did he fail in that, when contempt arose between Sarah and Hagar, he didn't step in. He didn't intervene. Not only did he make the original mistake, he then kind of let it fester, and it led into more heartache. See, modern women are indoctrinated by feminism. We men, 21st century American men are indoctrinated by feminism. To do this well, and to do this without overstepping our bounds, without being harsh, we need to be students of the Bible. We have to know that when we correct our wives on something, they know that what we're doing is because we believe it's in accordance with the Scriptures and therefore in their best benefit. It's in their best interest. We need to build capital in the small things. We need to do the daily things so that when we have a bigger ask of them, when we say, when we want to challenge them on something bigger, we've got some built up capital. It doesn't, we're not coming in and just demanding that they change this and that because I said so. We need to do the things day by day so that they recognize that we're trying. We're trying to lead well. We're not doing this because I woke up today on the wrong side of the bed and now I want to change the way we do everything. No, we're trying to bring our lives in accordance with Scripture. Some of the ways that we can do this is I know, some of the guys over there, this has been true of them. This is true of me. One thing that built a lot of capital was choosing a church. Asking your wife to submit to you and follow your leadership as you change churches when she's got friends at her church, that's kind of a big ask. But it wasn't too long until, Morgan's sitting there and we're in church and we're listening to Dr. O preach, and she's thanking me for leading her here, even though at first she was scared. Those are the things that build big capital. So we need to be willing to just kind of step out of our comfort zone. Another conversation that we've had that was a big ask, but has now built more capital, is in the area of modesty. There are things that Morgan was never immodest, but there were things that she would wear that would be considered modest by today's society, and yet should not be considered modest by the Church of God. So asking her, coming in and not saying, hey, I didn't wake up one morning and say, hey, I threw all your clothes out, you're not wearing them anymore. No, I sat down with her and said, hey, I need to talk to you. This is the reason I'm asking you to do this. And there was a little bit of frustration there. Morgan is a very sweet, submissive wife. And yet, again, there's that little bit of feminism that runs through all women today. It's in the air we breathe. We have it too. We just don't recognize it. But after explaining to her, listen, I've been a non-Christian man at the gym. I know what thoughts are going through the heads of these men. I don't want you in them. Reasoning with her like that, explaining, it makes her see it from the man's point of view. So where initially came off as frustration is now thankfulness. That's building capital. And lastly, we need to ensure that our wives are getting their theology from good sources. Again, so Dr. O, we have great preaching here. Family worship. I hope I'm giving my wife good theology. We need to make sure that we're studying the Bible ourselves so that we can teach our wives the Bible. But if you see an Amazon order, come across your phone, you get a little notification, and it says a Beth Moore book is being delivered to your church, maybe it's time to talk to your wife about, the books that she's reading. Say, hey, babe, it's Beth Moore, Priscilla Shirer, all these, ladies. That's not who you need to be reading. Let's talk about, some good books that you could read. Or maybe we'll talk to the other ladies at church that we respect and that we love and that we want to emulate as we age. Maybe we'll ask them some books that were transformative in their lives. We need to make sure our wives are getting good theology. And that kind of wraps up the 3 Ds. Disciplines. You can't pass on a faith you don't have yourself. Direction. If we're going to lead them, we need to lead them well. And lastly, discipleship. It's our duty to disciple our wives and our children. Doug Wilson says, authority flows to those who take responsibility. So let's take responsibility. If we want to be foundational patriarchs, then we want to lay the foundational work of our family. We want to take responsibility, we want to lead. God made us leaders. He providentially placed us in relationship with our wives and, Lord willing, our children. Lead well, lead with your extended legacy in mind, and most importantly, lead for the glory of God. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for these men who are willing to wake up early on a Saturday morning, knowing that after breakfast and a message, Lord, the snow remains. Lord, thank you for these faithful men. Lord, may you bless their efforts to lead their families. May you grant them success in evangelizing their wives and children and grandchildren. And Lord, may you receive all the glory and honor from it. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Real